Let's talk about adding textures to the surface. Now remember, you are adding textures to a three-dimensional form, so keep that in mind, but I'm going to be demonstrating mostly on just flat pieces of clay. So our first type of texture are called impressions. This is where you're pushing a form, some sort of object, onto the surface where it forms an impression of that object. Now, most of you are familiar that you can take a texture roller, so you could roll this on the surface, and then you can see it creates an impression of the design. You can also take one of these texture rollers and roll in two directions, and then you end up with this kind of waffle-like appearance. You can also take a texture mat, push it onto the surface, or roll a rolling pin on it, and that will create a texture as well. Also apply textures using these plaster impression stamps. They're made of plaster, so be gentle with them. And I have a variety of different types, but what you do is you take it and you just push it into the surface, and you can create these really interesting textures and designs. This one looks like a little rose. You can also use natural forms. I do have some seashells in the classroom. You can create these irregular textures. It looks a little odd, I'll admit, but if you're trying to just create something that looks a little natural, you can also push this into the surface. And just don't forget your sculpting tools. You can also make textures just by pushing them into the surface. If you are using the plastic sculpting tools to make impressions though, please be aware that if you push super hard, you could break them. I'm also taking the wooden tools. So there are many ways to make impressions, even using the fettling knife to get those types of designs on there. Second texture method are carvings. Yes, you can carve into the surface of the clay. Just make sure it's not thin. If it's thin, you might poke a hole. So what is carving? You're removing large sections of clay. So it is typically easier to plan out your carvings first by drawing where you plan to do the carving. For example, let's say I'm going to be carving out this shape. So you can use your ribbon tools. Ribbon tools are excellent for carving. I have some of these smaller ones in the classroom, but you're just removing layers of clay. And it is easier to carve when your clay is in the leather hard stage. If it's in the plastic stage, you end up with lots of boogers. But that's why when you're carving from the surface of the clay, it might be easier to also have some water available, because then you can help kind of smooth out the surface. So you can see here, I just used this smaller ribbon tool just to remove this layer. I could go a little deeper, but if I want to smooth this out now, I can take a little water. I can go back in with my tool here. But that's how you take care of carvings. You can also just carve using the ribbon tool on its own. Let's say you just want a series of lines like this in the surface. That is carving as well. But if you have a dedicated area to carve, it is a lot easier to draw out your area with the needle tool first. Third texture method is called incising. So what you're doing is, typically with incising, we use that method to create lines. And the best tool to use is a ball stylus tool. It's a tool that has two little balls at the end. You could use your needle tool, but you'll end up with pretty thin lines. So incising, you can just draw thicker lines here with the ball stylus tool. And what's nice about these lines is it's so easy to glaze. It's easy to glaze these types of lines because it's easier to get the glaze inside. If you use this, that does create a texture. But again, if your clay is plastic, you'll end up with a lot of boogers. Now let me show you an example of incising. This is a form, but you see those light blue lines? That is where the incising was. And then looking at this part of this sculpture here, the horns, that has incising. And then also the tail has some incising, and I did that using the needle tool. Fourth texture method are called appliques. What it is you are taking 3D forms that are attached to the surface. This technique makes your work look so much more interesting because it is a sculpture. I'll show you a couple examples. This top portion of this sculpture, all these coils that were attached, these are appliques. The yellow stars, those are appliques. The green leaves, those are appliques. We have a tile here. These spheres, those are appliques. Again, you don't want your appliques to be any thicker than your thumb. Even this letter J and this flower, they're 3D, they were scored and slipped. So anytime you're doing appliques, which are 3D parts, you need to score and slip. Here's another one. Here we got this part here of the arms that has appliques, these coils here on the surface. Those are appliques. So how do appliques work? So you can use cookie cutters to cut out shapes. What you would do is take a piece of clay, flatten it out, smooth it out, cut out the shapes you want from it. Again, you need to score and slip. So I'm going to apply slip to the surface here. The thing about using appliques is you need to make sure that you're cleaning up all of your score marks. So you need to go in using your sculpture tools because we don't want to see any of the score marks. You can also take a flat piece of clay and you could create an impression on the surface and then actually cut out the shape that you need. You can trim this piece of clay and then you can score and slip it. So you're like combining textures together, right? So we're going to score, 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 and we're going to score where this is going to be placed. And I need my slip here. And we're going to add that on top. So it's like double texture. I have an impression on an applique. Can you do the same thing with texture rollers and texture mats? Yes, right? I could use this texture here that I'm pushing on the surface. I could cut that out and then apply that to the surface of my clay. I can also take clay and make a small coil. I could even flatten it out, score it here because that's where I'm going to attach it. Add the slip, and then work on smoothing out all those score marks. So there's a lot of things you can do with appliques. If you want to make like a scale kind of effect, you can cut out a bunch of shapes and then score and slip them on the surface. A few more examples of appliques. So this effect here, I created that by creating these pieces of clay, these shapes, and then scoring and slipping them on the surface. These were created using coils, and you can tell when your clay is soft enough, you can also just make these really sculptural marks on the surface. Now, can you sculpt with slip? If your slip is somewhat thick like this, almost like really thick yogurt or frosting, you can also sculpt with it. So it seems kind of odd, but maybe that's a type of texture you'd like to use. You know, what if you kind of, move these edges around using a ball stylus tool? It's gonna dry and you would still glaze it as normal. So you have a lot of choices for your application of textures to the surface.